8:30. Thanks everyone for joining February 16th, the Finance Committee meeting. This is being live streamed and recorded. Today, I think since the meeting last month, there's been some clarity on the revenue side, which I think is where we're going to focus the attention today. And we have a presentation from Dr. Yanni. So good morning.
Good morning. Thank you very much. Mr. Orlando and I will be talking primarily about revenue today, and then at the end we can talk about our next steps with the budget. So as Dr. Ritke said, today's presentation really is about building coherence around the budget on the revenue side. So Ms. Pringle, if you can go to the next slide. So we'll talk about two large topics today, one being the Commonwealth budget. The governor gave his budget address on February 6th and talk about the implications that we know so far for Lower Merion and what the budget process or how the budget process will roll out from here in terms of state funding. And then we'll talk a little bit about some trends with our sources of revenue and where we are locally with our budget. So to bring everybody up to speed, over the last couple of years, there's been a multi-district lawsuit against the Pennsylvania Department of Education that ended with a ruling that cited the state's education funding system as being unconstitutional for not being able to provide both an effective and efficient system of education. Keep in mind that Pennsylvania is the 46th least transparent they have the 46th least transparent funding formula in the nation, only followed by Alabama, Arkansas, Mississippi, and Oklahoma. We don't know all of the ramifications of what that lawsuit is going to do, although we'll talk a little bit about some of the early signs that we're seeing. The proposed funding for this next school year really is meant to be a first step in adequately funding education across the Commonwealth. And when we talk about what we're seeing in our early allocations, you'll see that it appears that our increases from the state are minimal. And it appears that the large majority of funding will go to districts that have been historically underfunded for some time in our state. And then we'll talk a little bit about the proposed increases for our district. I really, and Mr. Orlando will talk about this as well, we really want to stress that all of the numbers that you see in today's presentation are preliminary. You'll remember that, excuse me, you'll remember that the state just finalized the current year's budget in December, and the governor's budget address on February 6th is just the first step in the budget process. So we anticipate that there is a very long road ahead with the state legislature negotiating any type of final budget. Ms. Pringle, if you can go to the next slide, please. So when the governor gave his budget address, he proposed nearly $1.1 billion increase to basic education. And so there are two big buckets that the state budget really is delivered in, and one being basic ed, and then the other being special ed. And then there are a couple then there are many other sub buckets, but the two that we're going to focus on are basic education and special education. So in basic ed, as I said, Governor Shapiro recommended a $1.1 billion increase. Of that 1.1 million, 900 million is proposed as a first year adequacy investment. And so that means that districts that have been historically underfunded and have had low performance will get the majority of that 900 million. The other 200 million is spread across those districts that have not been historically underfunded by the state. And that's distributed through the basic education funding formula. So if you look over to the side of your screen, you'll see that in this current year, 23-24, you'll see that we received approximately $5,715,811 through basic education formula. And next year, the proposal is that we will receive $5,940,603, or about a $224,000 or 3.93% increase. That increase, I mean, we're grateful for any increase that we get under the state budget, but that increase is lower than what we had anticipated and what we have gotten before. And we see that largely because of the way the money is being now routed from the state to districts that have been historically underfunded. While we don't, while we don't want any district to be underfunded, we do have to acknowledge that anytime we get less money from the state, um, or our increase is not as large as we believe it should, it does shift some of that burden to our local taxpayers. We know in Lower Merion, we are almost fully dependent upon local tax effort. Um, because in a $300 million plus budget, I don't want to say only, but we only receive, or will only receive $5.9 million from the state. Again, that is a preliminary number. That number will likely not go up, but we could see a reduction in that number, and we'll watch that over the next couple of months. In terms of special education, the governor proposed an increase of 50 million. Interestingly enough, last year, Governor Shapiro proposed an increase of 100 million and only got 50 million. So the state legislature only gave him half of what he wanted. So it'll be interesting to see if he receives, or if the state legislature will end at this 50 million a dollar figure that he is asking for this year. The language around this, though, is pretty significant, because the language is to ensure that school districts have basic resources necessary to provide high quality special education services. Ensure school districts have basic resources and high quality special education services. Those phrases are juxtapositions of each other. Basic resources don't allow you to have high quality special education services. So there's been a lot of talk about what's going to happen with this $50 million, and how that, if the governor gets all of that, how that will be divided. In this current budget year, we received $3,332,688,000. And in next year's budget, we are projected to get $3,393,646, which is just about a $60,000, almost $61,000 increase, or a 1.8% increase. Just to put this in context, so we have about 8,600 students. The state average in special education is around 17.8% as of last week. We're running between 20 and 21% of our students are identified and are in our special education program. So again, while we're very thankful to the state for an increase, that is an incredibly small, very minimal increase, as we think about not only the number of students that we have in our special education programs, but also the quality of our special education programs, and the quality that not only our community demands, but frankly that our students deserve. So overall, you'll see that our total increase from the state, when you add up basic ed and special ed, is less than $300,000. Again, grateful for any increase we get from the state, but in a $300 million plus budget, a $300,000 increase is minimal for us. Ms. Pringle, if you can go to the next slide. There are a number of unknowns in the budget. So for as long as I can remember now, at least going back 7 or 8 years, there's been conversations in our state about cyber education funding reform. Excuse me. cyber charter schools have been turning extremely large profits. And let me be clear that we are not opposed to parents and guardians and caregivers selecting what they believe is the best setting for their child or their children. But what we are opposed to is when a cyber charter school like uh, PALCS, Pennsylvania Leadership Cyber Charter School, when their actual cost to educate a child is somewhere between 45 and $5,500, and Lower Merion is spending anywhere from 20,000 plus for an special education or child to almost $60,000 for a student in special education, you can see that those entities turn huge profits. Well, what we have been advocating for and what many of districts have been advocating for is some common sense reform around the way cyber charter schools are funded. And so the governor has proposed setting a cyber tuition rate of $8,000 per school year. As you can imagine, cyber charters are backed well by very wealthy people with a lot of political connections. And so, therefore, over the years, as this has been talked about, there's been a lot of pushback here and nothing really has materialized. We're cautiously optimistic that that this statewide cyber tuition rate will become a reality. But again, we won't know that until we're further along in the budget process. Last couple of years, there's been a funding stream for school safety and security grants. Um, the governor is proposing $50 million as an annual investment um, in school and security improvements. We don't have any clarity around that right now, so we don't have any money allocated from a funding stream like this in our budget at this moment. And he also proposed a $300 million sustainable funding for environmental repair in school buildings. And there was a lot of excitement around that because, school districts have long sought some reimbursement under the ClanCon process for school construction. And for many years, that line item was zeroed out. It's unclear how that $300 million will be dispersed. One thing for sure, there was a statistic that the Scranton School District in northeastern Pennsylvania, that district alone has more than $300 million in projects they need to do. They also cited Erie, Duquesne School District of Philadelphia, and Pittsburgh City School District. And the total figure of immediate work that needs to be done in those districts as a total is in excess of $4 billion. So I fully expect, although we see this proposal in the state budget, that Lower Merion and districts like us will not realize any funding for environmental repair of school buildings. Over the last couple of years, districts have received mental health funding from the ESSER ARP stimulus package. We know that if that funding stream does not continue, that districts across the state we talk about a fiscal cliff, but we're really talking about a mental health cliff here as well, because of the 500 school districts, 463 used ESSER ARP dollars to fund some mental health supports for students. So minus that funding, remaining, there's going to be a huge lack of mental health services in our schools. There's no clarity yet. We were hoping by this week we would have some clarity about how that $100 million would be divided up, but there's no clarity around that yet. And then the governor has proposed an investment of $3 million to provide menstrual hygiene products at no cost to students in schools. And there's no clarity around how that will manifest itself either. So along with our special education increase and our basic education increase, we'll of course be watching those. We're also very interested in these 4 bullet points because this will, as we get clarity around these, it will help us to understand what what money we have to put in the budget. But keep in mind, when we get money, you know, any money that we get from these four buckets, they they will have corresponding revenue items to go, or I'm sorry, expenditure items to go along with them. So these are not windfalls of money. These would be funding streams that would help us maintain programming in the school district. Springo, if you can go to the next slide. I've asked Mr. Orlando to talk about a number of portions of our revenue. You'll see on this slide, and you'll see it on the next slide as well. There are a number of markers there that are numbered so that you can focus your attention on some specific line items that we'll talk about. And after Mr. Orlando talks about this slide and the next, then we'll be happy to take some questions.
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Yanni. As Steve mentioned, this slide here and the next slide, we'll go over the three main sources, which is local, state, and federal. And you can see, as Dr. Yanni mentioned, the vast majority, or 80% of our revenue comes from local sources. And we try to just kind of pinpoint, I guess, the major ones that we think will impact. So you talk about the current real estate taxes. That is the annual tax bill that goes out, and that's based upon the assessed value, the collection rate, and also what the millage rate is. And you can see the 262 million would be going to the index, which is 5.3%. It also includes a rescission under Act 1 of our debt service that was paid off for the high school projects is included in that number. One thing to note about the assessed value, that is subject to any type of appeals. So that assessed value could very well go down. We have numerous appeals, both many large commercial properties that still have to be resolved. So that revenue source actually may decline between now and we get to the final budget. The next one is interim taxes. Interim taxes basically is new construction. So you can see, a couple of years ago, we had a lot of new construction going on with interest rates going high. You can see that that revenue source now is declining rather rapidly in this year and into next year. Real estate transfer taxes, that is when properties are sold. So we get a portion of that 2% from the sale. And you can see as interest rates are going up, you can see there's been a decline in the amount of revenue from the transfer taxes. And then the other one we just kind of note is the earnings on investments. So you can see, we're getting 5.2%. Some investments may be higher than that. We're really subject to whatever the Fed does as far as cutting the rates, and working with our investment bankers through the Pennsylvania School District Liquid Asset Fund. They see that rate is going to decline to somewhere below 4% in next fiscal year. So you can see there's a 25% reduction right now based upon the current analysis, and we'll keep updating as more information becomes available. With that, on all of these numbers, again, as Dr. Yanni said, we're in preliminary stages. We still have another 5 months of data for this year to see kind of how we're going to end up. So they're some of the major points that we have right now. And we add up some of the other items in there. We're right now around 277 million in local sources, we believe, for the next year's budget. Next page.
I just want to give a shout out to Mr. Orlando, because he's been keeping in contact with PFM to really watch what's going to happen with the interest rates. In the last meeting, we talked about as interest income goes down, we may see transfer tax going up because more houses may be being purchased, but it's not necessarily going to be, a one-to-one correspondence. So what we may see is the interest income continue to trail off and not, at least initially, see the transfer tax go up. But as Mr. Orlando said, we still have 5 months, so we'll keep looking at these numbers and bringing back updates to the board.
The next slide is the state revenue. I think as Dr. Yanni mentioned, the first one is the basic education funding formula. And I think as Dr. Yanni mentioned, proposed right now is a little over 200, I think $24,000. And that's coming out of that $200 million pot of money that the governor has proposed. We'll see between now and the next several months what the numbers end up actually being. Most likely, you're not going to have a final Commonwealth budget prior to us approving the budget for next year. The likelihood is not very likely that's going to happen. So we'll do our best dealing with the state associations to kind of get a feel as to what we believe, a accurate number should be that we can budget for 24-25. Special ed funding, Dr. Yanni mentioned about that number. Again, it's to the basic formula. There is another pot of money called contingency funding, which is for high expense students that we apply for every year. That's the $150,000 addition to the number he had earlier. Let's see, state property tax reduction allocation, that is under Act 1 with the homestead. That number is blank right now. The director of budget on April 15th will then certify the number. Once we get that number, probably the same or close to the 4.3 million, we'll add that number to it. It just will reduce the current real estate revenue and shift down to the state. The mental health, as Dr. Yanni mentioned, there's a proposal there. The state budget was just approved, so we're in the process of applying an application for those funds this month. So that just became new. And then the other two major ones, the basic education, Social Security payments, and the state share retirement, we get 50% of our expense reimbursed by the state. So that becomes up to the 44 million roughly. And then as far as federal goes, you can see the numbers are declining. That's due to the ESSER and the COVID monies that we've received. Those monies no longer are available. So basically the 1.7 is our Access program, which is the Medicaid special ed reimbursement plan program. And then our title programs like Title I, Title II, that equals the $1.7 million roughly. And then you can see our total revenues just over $323.5 million. And again, we'll keep looking at these figures as more information comes in. Obviously, we're still working on our personnel plan, so that's going to affect our costs on personnel, which will affect Social Security and retirement revenue figures. So those numbers will be adjusted as we get further along in the process.
I think what's really important for everyone to know, I think every year as a superintendent, so this is my 8th budget as a superintendent, and every year I feel like I'm saying the same thing. It's frustrating to build a budget when we don't have clarity from the state. I think this year is probably truly the most frustrated that I've been and I'm going to be because of the way funding is being rerouted. There are other districts in our county that have been underfunded or supposedly underfunded, allegedly underfunded for a long time, and they're set to get really big increases. They're in a similar position because they can't really prepare a budget on really big increases without having clarity. So, I don't know that we're in any better or worse position. Obviously, we would like to be getting a little bit more from the state, and we're going to advocate for that. But the old adage that we're going to build a budget blind, I think is going to be really true. In terms of federal funding, we're on the very beginning of that runway up to the next presidential election. It is really to be determined what's going to happen with federal funding. As Mr. Orlando mentioned, Title I, which is primarily our reading services, Title II, predominantly our professional development services, and Title III, our ELD program, and Title IV, some other funding. Those are going to be significant unknowns. And so we're being extra cautious and extra methodical as we go through the expenditure side of the budget to make sure that we are building really a needs-based budget so that we'll be able to give the board an accurate picture as possible moving forward.
Mhm. Yeah, well, thank you very much. I guess, did we have any community comments, Ms. LaPera? Did anybody have anything?
Usually we do board questions first
All right,
and then
okay.
ask people to raise their
All right.
hand. So if you raise your hand, you'll automatically on my screen come up, and then I'll just, if it's okay with you, Todd, I'll go ahead and let you know who the next person is. Right
Oh,
now we
cool.
have
Yeah, I just want to
Sheena.
make sure we had an opportunity. Yeah, Shayna, you got a question? I have a couple of questions too, but we can let Shayna go first.
Sorry, here, wait. Oh, my camera's not, there we go. I just wanted to ask about the state increase in special ed funding and if that was enough, at least like the increased amount was enough to cover the increased cost that we're experiencing from the new regulation that raised the age of some of our highest cost special education students that came in at the beginning of the year.
No, and I know Ms. Fraser's on here, but I think we projected, that's a good question, Ms. Kalish. We probably should have brought that up. You know, the late breaking change in IDEA at the end of August now affords students the opportunity to stay with us until they're 22. That we projected that somewhere to be around 250,000, a little north of 250,000. We have also during the school year gained some students that moved into the district that were already in placements. And so that increase really dwarfs, it's just a small percentage of what those other increases were. I don't know, Ms. Fraser, if you're comfortable or if you would like to add anything. I don't know if I did that justice.
You did it perfectly. That's what I would have said.
Great. So the shortfall, if I'm doing the mental math correctly, is about $100,000 from what the increase they're giving us is to what the increase in cost would be, or is it more than that?
It would be, you know, for those just for that line item of those students that were afforded the ability to stay with us until they were 22.
Yeah, but the cost of that is how much more is that change costing us versus how the increase that the state is offering us in that funding?
That would be, you're right about that. It would be it's about $100,000 shortfall for that one group of students.
Okay. I think maybe at some point during these meetings, we should talk about how board members and community members might advocate to our state level legislators and perhaps the governor, since he is local and might be interested in hearing from us about how these changes in certain line items would affect us individually at our district. And so that would be a good thing to arm our board members and our community members with that information.
And we can share those, Ms. Kalish. I put together some talking points internally that we've shared with our local state reps and our state senators, but we can make sure that the board gets that, and we can make sure that you know, at our next meeting and at other meetings of the board, we can bring that up as well. Thank you for that.
Perfect. Thank you.
Steve, can I just make one comment? I think historically special ed funding has been woefully underfunded. You know, we're talking one specific line item, but the whole special ed 1200 function is well over $60 million just to fund the program. And that doesn't include any auxiliary costs for counseling, psychological services, and transportation. It's millions of dollars more than that. And getting on 3.3 million, it's a drop in the bucket.
Right. And that's something that has been in advocacy for years and years and years. And so, you know, there's a dearth of state funding for special ed, and at the federal level, IDEA has never been funded at the level that it was promised, you know, over the years.
Okay,
Mel,
Melanie?
like you had
Okay.
a question too?
Thanks. Yeah, mine kind of falls in the same category again. I'm just wondering, because we're talking about the ESSER fund loss, and I'm wondering, and I'm looking at what will be the impact on the budgets as far as when it relates to special ed. When we have students in special ed, how do we partition out the difference between mental health services and special ed services? And is there a partition, or do they tend to be that pool of funding comes all under special ed. So I'm just wondering, will that impact special ed? That's if the loss of the mental health, the ESSER funding.
So yes, and I'll let Ms. Frazier, I'll kind of tee this up and then let Ms. Frazier. So the mental health funding has been somewhat universal, able to be accessed by all students. However, there are any number of our special education students or students in special education that access these services as well. So it will be a hit to both, or to all students, our regular education students, or students that might have 504s for anxiety and other diagnoses, and our students in special education.
Yeah, because what we've utilized the ESSER funds for our counselors, right, to be able to support. So that's beyond students with disabilities. And then there's a difference between like what we do through student services through mental health supports. And then if individual students have needs that rise to the level of special education for those mental health needs, that's provided through special education through emotional support programming. And that is supported by our school psychologists, our school social workers, counselors have a role in that. So budgetary wise, all of that falls under my department, but special education services are one part of that. And as Vic said, there's a lot of other expenses like our clinical team members that support those programs, but are under a different budget line.
Okay, so thanks. I appreciate that. That sounds like it's just going to be a hit all the way around.
Yes.
For the budget. Okay, thank you.
If nobody else, I had two things, a short one. We spent some time talking about the $8,000 cap on the cyber charter tuition. I just wondered if that were to go through, what kind of impact would that have on our expenditures? Is that like a big deal for us, or is that like a trivial little wisp?
It would have a somewhat significant impact. We can get you those exact numbers. Miss Schaefer, the cyber school budget comes under her office. We can make sure that we get that in. Well, it comes under her budget for right now, but we can get you that. Do we know, Mr. Orlando, roughly what a tuition is for a regular education student and what it is for a special education student?
So for the current year, it's just under $23,000 for regular ed and over 61,000 for special ed student for the current year.
And to put that in perspective, like for special education ones fall under me, we average around 14 students a year that are identified as special education in a charter school, to give you an idea.
14. Yeah. All right. Thanks. Yeah. So just breaking that out next time we look at our expenditure sheet, that'd be great. And then the other question I had, so it looks like, so the real estate obviously is the major source of revenue, right? So you're projecting 262 versus 246 last year. So that's an increase of 6.5%, which seems more than the Act One, especially when you factor in the rescission. So could you just explain the disconnect?
So the 23-24 includes the homestead 4.3 million reduction. That revenue is not reflected. So you have to take the 4.3 million off that 162. There was another extra $1 million for the settlement last year that has gone away also. That's reflected under miscellaneous. So there's over $5 million right there. $5-6 million of that 2.6 million is somewhat inflated right now.
Okay.
So that's why, as Dr. Yanni said, as we get further along, we get to the preliminary budget and proposed final budget, you'll see those numbers all will change, once we get into the system. Right now, you can't go into the state system, put in a homestead, since there's no homestead being declared yet. So those numbers are going to change. So it's just really shifting the money to different components.
Okay. But at the end, that should align, right? When you
It'll
factor
align.
rescission to the Act One, that should be the same percentage here. Okay.
Well, it's going to, with the rescission, you're going to be slightly below
Right.
the 5.3 because your rescission, yes.
Correct. Right. No, that I understand.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Kimberly Garrison,
Kimberly.
sorry.
Thanks, Denise. I wanted to ask a question around you, Mr. Orlando. You just stated that for charter schools, we pay 23,000 for a regular student and 61,000 for a special education student attending a charter. What do we pay for the students who actually attend our schools currently? What do we spend, I should say?
I don't have a figure as to, I mean, what we spend per child, and I think we get the special ed, it varies depending upon the services, so I
Right,
can't
I'm just
give you-
talking about an estimate. I mean, we should know, have an estimate of what we spend per regular student within the district.
We can put that in the notes. That
Yeah.
that just for everyone's clarity, that formula that ends up where we derive the tuition for cyber charter school students comes from a state mandated formula. When districts look at how much they spend per student, there's multiple ways to calculate that. If you include debt service, if you don't include debt service. So what we can do, and we can make sure that that's in future positions, or I'm sorry, future presentations, we can make sure that those figures are there so that we can see, we're transparent about what our costs per student are.
Thank you.
I think the central question, Ms. Garrison was probably asking, is it, does it cost us, I mean, is it better for the student and also better financially to keep that student within house? Or, you know, what's the financial disparity or the delta there for cyber charter versus our own services? I think that was sort of the intent of the question. Is that right, Kimberly?
That was partially, but I mean,
Okay.
I want to know what we're spending per student in our own, you know, within the district.
One of the things that I will say, and you know, I've been chided for this in the past in other districts, when you look at performance of cyber charter schools, most of them do not perform as well as traditional public schools. And they definitely don't perform the way that our students do in Lower Merion. It is incredibly difficult to provide in a cyber environment long-term, specially designed instruction, related services, etc. And so many times what winds up happening is the students are not really getting what they need. Oftentimes we have students that leave us that are regular education students. And when they arrive in cyber charter school, they become special education students. And as a result of that, we don't have the right legally to see much of the information about that student's diagnosis and what supports and services they're getting. Over the years, that has been a common concern and complaint from school districts about how regular education students leave us to go to the cyber environment, and then they become special education students. Personally, I'm always going to believe that when students need intricate special education services, we can do that better face-to-face, whether it's with us or in an approved private school where they can get that one-on-one attention. Although I'm never going to say that I wouldn't support a parent's choice to go to a cyber school if ultimately they think that's better for their kids.
May I, Steve, too? Like the other thing that's distinctive about the special education piece is we aren't given information about the student, but they could be a speech disability and get like one therapy session a week, and we still pay that same tuition amount. In contrast to that, it could be a student that has significant needs and gets a high level of special education. There's no distinction made in our cost for those charter schools for special education students. It's the same cost no matter what services they receive.
All right. Yeah, that seems especially perplexing. I don't quite understand that, but all right.
Well, Dr.
Yeah.
Ritke, I would say welcome to the club because we've been fighting against that as well. So
I'm still trying to get my head around what that makes no sense, but
Yeah.
okay. All right. Very good. Well, thanks everyone. if there's nothing else, I think we'll adjourn and we'll meet. Wait, we got one last minute question sneaking under the wire.
Yeah, I was just gonna say.
Matthew?
Thank you.
Comment?
Apologies. I thought there was going to be a separate call for community questions. I have a question about the impact of the expanded walk zone for next year. How much does the district anticipate that it will save through its realization of busing efficiencies?
Oh, that's Matthew, thank you. That's a really good question. We don't actually anticipate that it will save any money. Right now we are 16 drivers short. We have 4 more that are out on extended leave, and we're expecting a minimum of 6, but up to 10 retirements between now and the start of the school year. So we don't anticipate we don't anticipate any financial savings from the extended walk zones.
Thank you.
All right, going once, twice.
We're good.
All right, folks, thanks very much. We'll adjourn the meeting and convene again next month.